can't breathe.
I 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 can't
I
breathe.
can't breathe.
No puedo respirar.
I can't breathe.
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 Can't breathe.
I 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 can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
I can't breathe. Enough is enough.
Hi there, and welcome to today's virtual town hall meeting entitled Moving Florida Forward, a conversation on racial justice. I want to thank my good friend, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, for co-hosting this event with me, along with the most esteemed members of the United States Congress, the Florida delegation, my esteemed congressional colleagues, on board with us as well, and to welcome two of the nation's and the world's preeminent scholars and presenters on the subject at hand, the former Attorney General Eric Holder and former Police Commissioner Charles Ramsey. We thank them so much for giving us their time. I also welcome our incredible panelists, and of course, all of you in the audience, ladies and gentlemen. The time's called for this important discussion, and I'm certain that it will be fruitful. In the past few weeks, the murder of George Floyd has sparked a global movement demanding that those who lead pay heed to the calls for justice for Black people, Indigenous peoples, and other people of color. And in this call for justice has been a cry to not let go unsaid the names of others, specifically Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. There are, of course, other names, Corey Jones, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, and the most recent, Rayshard Brooks. The list goes back 400 years and will keep going into the future if we don't make significant strides in rooting out the systemic racism that has corroded and corrupted our laws, our institutions, and for too many of our fellow Americans, our hearts. I know today's conversation will be respectful, helpful, and very possibly difficult, sometimes raw. Frankly, if we're going to move forward, we're going to be one nation. If we are going to make a more perfect union, then it is the difficult discussions that we will need to have with one another. Thank you again to all of you for being here, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Congressman Hastings. It's an honor to serve in the United States House of Representatives with you and to co-host this very special virtual town hall on racial justice this evening. Tonight, and thanks to everyone for joining us, we'll begin a dialogue that is long overdue, and tragically one that we're only having now because several African Americans have died at the hands of police, and because Floridians and millions of Americans responded to it by demanding racial justice and police reforms. The public execution of George Floyd put an appalling spotlight on the racist treatment that so many communities of color live in fear of every single day. But out of this brutal act of criminality, real progress can and must emerge, and it's within our reach. At no time in my life have I seen such momentum and passion to confront this nation's racism, and just as important, a commitment to actually do something serious about it. So in this moment of pain, outrage, and grief, I carry the hope that we will accomplish real change, real reform, and real results. Our challenge now is, as always, sustaining this historic momentum. And it is truly historic. In the 60s, when I was a very little girl, America witnessed hundreds of demonstrations, riots, and uprisings, protests that centered on the many of the same issues that we confront today. Over the last few weeks, even amid a pandemic, we saw thousands of mass gatherings to demand racial justice and police accountability, and not just in Florida or America, but around the globe. There are so many fronts in this fight. We must tear down the totems to racism that have haunted our communities on prominent buildings, street signs, and statues. We must transform the way police interact with communities of color. We must untangle a whole web of legal reforms to make equal justice under the law possible for everyone. And of course, so many of these reforms can only come to fruition through the ballot box. If we elect leaders who deny that racism remains as a virus infecting our society, or worse, leaders who choose to inflame racist animosities for political gain, all of our marching and demands will be for naught. When someone is murdered so ruthlessly as George Floyd was, we need to call out and cry out. But rather than just agonize, we need to organize and vote. And tonight is only the beginning. We must do the real work as policymakers, activists, law enforcement, community leaders, and Floridians. And we need to make sure that our state and our nation are better. Because as our dear friend and colleague, the late Elijah Cummings, often said, we are better than this. From our 82nd United States Attorney General Eric Holder and Commissioner Charles Ramsey to legal and activist heavyweights Leon Russell, Benjamin Crump, and Rodney Hurst, we have assembled guests to help inform and inspire us. We will also hear from leaders where a lot of this meaningful change will likely take place at the local and state levels. State Representative State Representative Tracy Davis of Jacksonville and Coral Springs Commissioner Joshua Simmons are both going to join us this evening. We will hear from all of them and break up into smaller panels that will also include Florida's Democratic Congressional delegation. This will be a 2-hour conversation, and we obviously won't get to every question, but we want to share and hear from you, our constituents and viewers. So if you're watching, please post questions or comments that you think will further this crucial discussion. And with that, I'd like to welcome the 82nd Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder. General Holder dealt with a police shooting that outraged Americans in Ferguson, Missouri. In many ways, Michael Brown's death was a key turning point that got us here in the first place. But the way General Holder handled the aftermath of that tragedy is far different from what's happening right now. I have the deepest respect for our first guest, especially the work he's doing now to stop gerrymandering, just one of many voter suppression tools used by those who would deny full voting rights to everyone. Mr. Holder, General Holder, is a staunch civil rights advocate, and his time in the Obama administration made him the first African American and the third longest serving Attorney General in American history. We are so proud as a delegation to host him here tonight, and it's my honor to bring to you our 82nd United States Attorney General, Eric Holder. General? Well,
thank you. It's good to be back in Florida, virtually anyway, and good to be here with all of you who are joining us here tonight. Thank you, Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz, for that really nice introduction and for all the great work that you're doing here. Thank you to Representative Hastings as well for having me with you this evening and with other members of the Florida Democratic delegation. It's a great delegation with a bunch of folks who have done a lot of great work, all of whom I consider to be really good friends. Now, I know that everyone here today is already working tirelessly to make Florida a more fair, and more just place to live for everyone. But I really want to drive home how important redistricting is, before I get into other things, but how important redistricting is to all of our missions, including criminal justice reform that we're gathered here tonight to discuss. Florida is a key target for my organization, the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, and for good reason. Florida is a growing swing state. You're poised to pick up at least 2 more congressional seats following the next census. It's also one of the most diverse states in the country, with a population that is nearly 1/4 Latino and Hispanic, and nearly 20% foreign-born. We need to ensure that the political makeup of the state actually represents the diversity of the voters. Your home state's important is exactly why we launched our affiliate group that's called All on the Line, and we hired Katie Visick to be our state director on the ground here. So we are allies in this fight for criminal justice reform, and we think that if we have fair districts drawn in 2021, that will hasten the time that will take to get us to the place that we need to be. There are 18,000 police departments in our country. The federal government can't impose regulations on each and every one of those departments. So there has to be, substantial amounts of local and state involvement. But there is clearly a role for the federal government to play by setting standards, for instance, that need to be met in order to receive federal grants. Now, I think it's important for us to really reimagine the way in which law enforcement interacts with communities of color. We should rethink what police officers are asked to respond to. Police officers are asked often to respond to mental health issues, people who are dealing with mental health issues, or, for example, as we have seen very tragically, dealing with somebody who is selling loose cigarettes, or potentially passing counterfeit checks or counterfeit bills. The police don't need to respond to all of these nonviolent incidents. We should think about where we want armed officers to actually be. We obviously need better training. We need more accountability. Police officers who do things inconsistent with their oaths, with their sworn duties, need to be held accountable. We also need a greater focus on measures designed to prevent people from becoming involved with the criminal justice system at all. We have to look at this, I think, holistically. This is not just a question of what we do or don't do with regard to police departments and police officers. We have to really ask ourselves more fundamental questions about our nation as a whole. Because I think we make a mistake if we think that the criminal justice system exists separate and apart from the greater society. Issues that we face in the criminal justice system, inappropriate uses of force, implicit bias, a whole range of things, these grow out of the same kinds of problems that we see in the larger society. And so we've got to deal with these problems more systemically, more society-wide, if we want actually to be effective in bringing about needed change with regard to the criminal justice system. And I think one of the key things that people have to understand that there is not a tension. There is not a tension between justice and having fair treatment and public safety. So there is no need to give up public safety in our quest for justice and equal treatment. You can keep people safe and also have a better, more equitable criminal justice system. And I think if you look back to the Obama years, it was for the first time in 40 years during the Obama administration that we reduced the number of people who were incarcerated in the federal system, and at the same time lowered the crime rate. So again, there is not that tension. I think you can make things better in terms of community and police relationships and keep people safe at the same time. And so what we tried to do was to come up with ways in which we could look at what we thought would be problems in the criminal justice system with regard to how policing was done, address those problems, involve the community in these efforts, and engage law enforcement as well. Bring them together in forums so that we could get to know each other and understand how difficult it is to be a police officer, understand how communities of color have had to deal with unfair law enforcement practices historically, and certainly over a great many years. It was through these kinds of meetings that we were able to form the policies that led to the 21st century proposals, the Task Force on 21st Century Policing. It was headed by Chuck Ramsey, who I think we're going to hear from later tonight. and the other things that we did, bringing, for instance, pattern or practice investigations, using that power that we had under the civil rights statutes to examine and to reform police departments in need of assistance. We need to hold individual officers accountable for their misdeeds, but we also need to take systemic looks at departments that have a history of these kinds of issues and make sure that we make more wide-ranging systemic reforms. There's much work that remains to be done. There are lives that need to be saved. Through legislation like that was introduced in the House this past week by House Democrats, and I'm extremely proud of that bill, extremely proud of the hard work that went into it and the comprehensive nature of the proposals that have been put forth. But through that kind of legislation, through hard work, through a willingness to confront the status quo, and that's the thing. There are a lot of people, a lot of organizations that will push back on our desires for reform. We have to be willing and be committed to confronting the status quo. I'm really cautiously optimistic that we can achieve meaningful change in the criminal justice system and amend it so that we keep people safe and treat people fairly. I look forward to working with all of you in connection with this work. I think this is our time to try to make the changes that for too long we have not implemented. We can't blow this opportunity. The people who are in the streets of our cities are patriots. They're doing what good American citizens have done for many, many years. But we have to convert the energy that we find in the streets into the legislation that was the capstone, for instance, of the civil rights movement. The 65 Voting Rights Act, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. We have to convert that energy into concrete measures that will make our criminal justice system more fair and more just. And as I said, I look forward to working with all of you in this endeavor.
Thank you so much, General Holder, and we really appreciate you joining us tonight and being willing to take a few questions. I know you have another engagement that you have to go to. These days, those engagements are all virtual, but we're still on a clock. So just wanted to. We've received a couple of questions while you were talking, and one of them you began to cover in your remarks. The Trump Justice Department essentially has abandoned the pattern and practice investigations that you referred to, and they've limited existing consent decrees to monitor police departments that have a history of constitutional abuses. Attorney General Barr refuses to open an investigation, for example, to take a holistic look at the Minneapolis Police Department, even after the death of George Floyd. So you mentioned pattern and practice investigations, and you led several, particularly after Ferguson, that looked at the Ferguson police. What impact can pattern and practice investigations have to reform police practices and make communities safer?
Well, I think that's an extremely useful tool. By looking at police departments in their entirety, you can put reforms in place that will change the conduct of individual officers and make a police department that is far more responsive to the needs of the community. When Attorney General Sessions took over, he basically closed down, as you indicated, these pattern and practice investigations and said that we only needed to look at the bad apples. And the vast majority of police officers, I think, do a good job. But those bad apples come from a tree that needs to be examined. And that's what pattern and practice investigations are all about. Yeah, hold individual officers accountable, but let's look at the police departments that tend to breed these people and come up with ways in which we stop these bad actions from happening by really getting at the larger police departments. The notion that you would not, for instance, look at the Minneapolis Police Department after what we saw that happened to George Floyd and other things that have happened with regard to that police department seems inconsistent to me with what the obligations, what the duties are of the people in the Justice Department.
It's really hard to imagine how you get systemic change and systemic reform in police culture if you don't engage in those kinds of investigations.
Yeah, I mean, we brought a record number of those cases during the Obama years, and I think they had an impact. It didn't mean that, every department was 100% where you needed them to be, but they were certainly better than when we began those investigations. And, the police departments oftentimes pushed back, didn't want to be involved in them. But we pushed and made sure that we used the authority that was given to us by the civil rights statutes to push those investigations and then reach consent decrees that were enforced by a federal judge. So those departments that were not willing to voluntarily make the necessary changes, they were forced to do so using our pattern of practice authority.
Yeah, and I mean, you had the ability to hold them accountable so that you could get the change that was necessary.
Yep.
During your time as Attorney General, you were a strong supporter of community policing. You know, I've noticed since the Obama administration came to an end, you know, those cops those cops grant programs are often proposed to be cut or eliminated by the Trump administration. Community policing as a strategy to improve public safety is important because it fosters collaboration between the community and the police. And particularly after the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, communities of color and people all over America have been extremely vocal about their anger and the mistrust that they feel towards police, and they're demanding tangible reforms. So can you talk about the impact and the effectiveness that you believe community policing has and what that would look like in a time like this? And is there room for effective community policing in a post-George Floyd world where we do have a significant erosion of trust in law enforcement, which obviously we need to repair badly and quickly, especially amongst our younger generations? Can you have accountability and community policing go hand in hand?
Yeah, I think you can. I think the points you make are really important. You know, there has been an erosion of trust. That trust needs to be rebuilt. It has to be rebuilt on the basis of facts, not on the basis of, you know, wishes and hopes. There needs to be reforms put in place. And so I think if we do that and reestablish the kind of trust that is necessary, you can have community policing. Community policing only really works well, however, when communities of color, for instance, trust the law enforcement representatives who will be community police officers. If there's not that necessary trust, you cannot have good, effective community policing. But I think you can have both. And I think we have to have both. We want to have that necessary trust, and we want our police officers to be involved in the life of our communities. You know, the stereotypes that too many people have, I think, in law enforcement about people in the communities that they serve really comes from a lack of interaction. It's easy to stereotype a group of people if you don't interact with them, if you don't have any sense of how they lead their lives, how they have just the normal desires that every American has. And community policing gives you the ability to do that. So again, build up trust and then go to making community policing real.
I want to just ask you one more quick question, because this is so timely for us right now, and it's really right in line with this issue. You know, an intersection of racial injustice and systemic voter suppression in the United States is the disenfranchisement of felons. And Floridians, as I know you're familiar, approved a constitutional amendment that re-enfranchises those who've been released, who paid their debt to society. Unfortunately, the previous Rick Scott administration and now DeSantis both worked to block the will of the people. The legislature has passed legislation that really has gummed up the ability for us to move forward with the voters' will. And we have the largest disenfranchisement rate of any state in the country. We have about 10% of the electorate, and even more strikingly, 23% of all Black voters unable to cast a vote as a result. Can you just talk about how does the disenfranchisement of those convicted of crimes contribute to systemic racism? And it just seems to me like it feeds a vicious cycle of oppression that continues to disempower people of color.
Yeah, I mean, this is a vicious cycle. It's a historical cycle. I mean, one looks back at the disenfranchisement statutes, and they're all rooted in the post-Civil War, where a determination was made by the status quo. Well, all right, we've got these newly freed people. How are we going to maintain power, electoral power over them? All right, we'll draw a statute that says if you are convicted of a felony, you can't vote. All right, that's fine. Maybe sounds kind of neutral on its face. Well, then we'll go out and arrest disproportionately people of color and disenfranchise them in that way. if you do that, you then have an ability not to interact with these folks, not come up with solutions to the problems that communities of color have to face. So if you are concerned as an African American with the way in which law enforcement has treated you presently and historically, but you don't have the ability to impact the system because you don't have the necessary votes, the old ways stay in effect. The old things that are unjust remain. And there's a direct connection. There's a direct connection between electoral power and reform. And the fact that over 60% of Floridians said that we want to make sure that those people who paid their debt to society have the right to vote, that would be stymied. That would be stymied. I mean, this is the greatest civil rights enfranchisement since the civil rights movement, what Florida did as a state just by itself. And to thwart the will of the people simply to maintain political power is inconsistent with what public officials are supposed to do. And I think it brings great shame to anybody in the state who supports that effort to disenfranchise people who the voters said should be re-enfranchised. And I hope that the courts will do the right thing and allow the will of the people to affect the necessary policy changes.
Absolutely, and thus far they have. We're up to the Court of Appeals now, and thus far we've been able to have the law the legislature passed struck down. It's been at least partially declared unconstitutional, and unfortunately, the governor is still appealing and trying to get a full ruling, en banc ruling from the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Hopefully, they won't take that up. Yeah. But we'll continue to encourage those folks to get registered and get ready to vote in August and in November.
Absolutely.
General Holder, thank you so much for giving us your time this evening on this really cataclysmic, monumentally important issue. It's been 400 years.
Yeah.
In making, and it's not going to be undone quickly or overnight, but we have to have good people come together like you and like our panel and the folks watching tonight to come together and make sure that we can right the wrongs of the last several centuries.
Yeah.
So that we can make sure that true equality is a real thing.
No, I am, as I said, I'm cautiously optimistic. I think that we have a moment clearly now. And now the question is, can we turn that moment into a movement? I think if we all work together, if we stay committed to the cause, we can bring about the change that we want. But we also have to understand, positive change doesn't happen on its own. It only happens when people commit themselves to making it happen. And so we have seen positive change come out of the civil rights movement where people sacrificed and committed themselves. That's the same thing that we have to do here with great leaders like you. I'm really confident that we can bring about the necessary changes and make this country better.
Thank you so much. We're all in this together. That's why my colleagues and I wanted to host this tonight. And thank you so much for kicking us off. We really appreciate it. And thank you for your service.
Sure enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Take care.
Okay. I want to thank General Holder once again. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to Commissioner Charles Ramsey, one of our nation's foremost experts on quality policing, having led forces in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. He built such stellar records there that President Obama tapped him to lead the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. Commissioner Ramsey, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Congresswoman. I was just listening to one of my heroes, quite frankly, General Holder, and he didn't leave a lot for me to say, to be honest with you. And I'm looking at the time, and I know we want to get to the panels and we want to get to the Q&A, but it's really an honor to be here with you tonight as part of this very important town hall. And as the Attorney General mentioned, this is a very significant moment for all of us across the country. I've been in law enforcement for a very long period of time. I actually started in Chicago as an 18-year-old police cadet, 1968. But the world was quite different in 1968. And I remember hearing Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz say she was just a little girl in the 60s. Well, I'm quite a bit older than you because I was a teenager during that time. So I remember very well the civil rights movement, all the different issues that were going on at the time. And what's happening now kind of reminds me a bit of that. And I just hope it's sustained long term, because reform is critically important. But I also think it would be a mistake if we just limited this conversation and what's happening right now to police reform. The entire criminal justice system needs reform. The police, prosecution, courts, corrections. We need to reimagine criminal justice in this country. I mean, what's the purpose of it? What should be the outcome? Is it to just punish? Is it to rehabilitate? Is it to reintegrate people back into society once they've paid their debt? Is it all the above? Now, we have the punishment part down pretty good. It's the other two that we lack. And unless we fix that, then we're going to be having problems as a result for a long period of time to come. What happened in Minneapolis, what happened in Atlanta, we can go city by city. These are abuses of power. They're wrong. The behavior is criminal. I mean, whatever it is that you want to say about it, I'd have a hard time arguing against it. And I wouldn't even try to argue against it. But even there, I think we need to find balance, because I think it's very important that we don't demonize all of policing. Policing has issues. There's no question about it. Is there racism in policing? Absolutely, there's racism in policing. And as General Holder said, we're just a reflection of the community that our officers come from. Now, there needs to be a much higher standard, no question about it. We have to look at our hiring. We have to look at our training. We have to look at policies. We have to look at all that. But we've got to change the hearts and minds of people. We have to get at the culture that exists. And there is a subculture in policing that is very much a part of the problem. We have to deal with the power of unions that have gotten to a point where in those jurisdictions where unions are allowed, have an incredible amount of power and makes it very difficult for a police chief to get rid of a problem officer. And so we've got to look at all these things. But in my opinion, these things are all fixable. Not overnight, but they're fixable. And it shouldn't take an incredibly long period of time. We're going to need legislation in some cases. We're going to need better training. We're going to need better selection. We need to hold people accountable. And whether it's being held accountable internally within the department for relatively minor infractions, when something rises to a criminal nature, obviously then that person needs to be prosecuted. The message has to be strong, and the message has to be consistent, that that kind of behavior is simply not going to be tolerated. And we owe it to the public that we serve to be as good and as effective a department as we can. But we're there to protect the constitutional rights of all people, not just enforce laws. We're there to protect people. And until we have a situation where out of the 18,000 police departments, every single one of them is on the same page and understands that, and we've got to have a lot of work to do. So again, I'm going to end there. I'll be around the entire session and engage during Q&A after the various panels. So with that, let me turn it back over to Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. And it's really just such an honor to have you join us. And I know we've all really appreciated your voice throughout this crisis and the growing movement that is so absolutely essential for us to actually achieve reform. We appreciate you joining us for the Q&A for our panels tonight as well. So now our first group of panelists will provide opening remarks, and then we'll get right into the Q&A. So I want to briefly introduce all of them now, and then they'll speak in that order. Leon Russell is a civil rights champion from the Tampa-St. Pete area. He was elected chairman of the NAACP's National Board of Directors in February 2017. And he's served on the NAACP Board of Directors for 27 years. So little Florida pride here in having a national NAACP leader. Coral Springs City Commissioner Joshua Simmons was first elected in November 2018. He's also a history teacher at Coral Springs High School. Commissioner Simmons is the first African-American commissioner to be elected since the city became incorporated in 1963. And he just had a baby girl on Sunday. So congratulations. Mazel tov, as we say in my tradition. Congressman Alcee Hastings is the Dean of the Florida Congressional Delegation. Congressman Hastings is our rock. He represents parts of Broward and Palm Beach counties. He is an iconic Florida civil rights leader that won so many civil rights victories along the way to becoming a federal judge and now a member of Congress since 1992. Congresswoman Kathy Castor is a senior member of our delegation on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. She chairs the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, and she represents the Tampa Bay area. Congressman Ted Deutch serves on the House Judiciary Committee as well as the Foreign Affairs Committee and is a senior member of both. He also chairs the House Committee on Ethics. He represents parts of Palm Beach and Broward counties. So with that, Mr. Russell, please take us away.
Thank you, Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz. It's a wonderful opportunity to join you this evening. Let me do my disclaimer very quickly. I'm here as chairman of the National Board of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, our 501c4 entity. We are nonpartisan, but we are not non-political. It's important for us to understand that where we are today, as we face the twin pandemics, first COVID-19 and then racism, it's important for us to understand that one leads to the disparate impact of the other. If this nation is ever going to reform, then we need to start by frankly understanding and finally confirming that we understand that we are a nation that was in fact created in racism. We shouldn't shy away from that fact, but it is time for us to face up to the fact and begin to fix it. When we think about the issues that we see with COVID, we see that public policy and bad public policy created by bad public policy makers will kill you. At the NAACP, we're done dying. And so our message this evening, quite frankly, whether it's with respect to police reform or the whole COVID issue or any of the plethora of issues that face our nation, it is we must face and begin to eliminate the impact of systemic racism from every aspect of this society. That's clear. It has to be done now. We can't think about police without understanding the fact that there would be no police if there had been no slaves who would run away, who would rebel, and who needed to be recaptured and who needed to be subject to black codes and things that kept them from being free. And so my final part of my opening is that the only way we change public policy to keep it from killing us is to ensure that public policy makers are elected. We go out, we fill out our census forms, we make sure that everyone who is eligible can vote, and we ensure that they're educated and that they get to the polls, and we change public policy making so that it impacts affirmatively the lives of every American.
Yeah.
Commissioner Simmons?
Thank you so much for having me, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Congressman Hastings. It's so great to see you, Congressman Ted Deutch, my congressman, and Representative Castor. I have not had the opportunity to meet you, but thank you for being here. And Mr. Russell, thank you so much for those words and getting us off on the good foot. The first thing I'll say is Black lives matter. Black women lives matter. Black trans lives matter. And I say that because a lot of the conversation, it's people think that that is a defensive a statement to take offense from. No, that's not. When we say Black lives matter, that is a call to action. That is a call for you to listen and understand the pain that Black Americans are going through every day in this country. And we're asking you to understand, and we're asking you to please take steps, take action steps and champion our struggles and make sure that we get the protections that we deserve. We've been singing the same songs for decades, for centuries, and yet we're still having issues and we're still having problems getting the change that we deserve. And so I'm grateful to talk about this. And I'll say in Coral Springs, with everything that happened, I formed a task force to go through and do reforms within our police department. And we actually had our first meeting today. Congressman Deutch, thank you for being a part of it. And, I just said, listen, it's not just policing. It's all of it. It's everything, right? It's continuing to see Black Americans die and be treated and vilified as the other. And as Mr. Russell said, we are done dying. When has a issue when it comes to Black Americans go global, right? We've seen protests throughout the world. That hardly ever happens. And I think any good-hearted person can see that the time is now to make changes. And so I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to give my energy to this effort. I'm so happy to live in a diverse city like Coral Springs, but also with a police department that understands that there is more that they can do, that they can be better. And so I think the time to have uncomfortable conversations with folks and lean into those difficult conversations to get through to the understanding and put your foot down and say, these are the things that need to change so that we can be better, then that's where we need to be. I look at it as improving the law enforcement profession. And I don't know what employer doesn't want to have their company or their agency become better. And I hope that's the standpoint that many other agencies will take throughout the country, because we want to go home and we want you to go home. We want to go home to our families and we want you to go home to your families. We don't want anybody to lose their life unnecessarily. And I think it's time that we continue to have these conversations, but also action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Simmons. Our colleague and dear friend, Congressman Alcee Hastings.
Thank you so much, Debbie, and thank all of the presenters, particularly Attorney General Holder and Chief Ramsey, who he and I were talking earlier, has had a very long day, as have most of us. I'd be terribly remiss if I did not express a debt of gratitude to Leon Russell. I wouldn't be in the United States Congress had there not been Leon Russell and the NAACP. I won't delve too much into it, but every time I see him, I'm obligated to express my gratitude. The other thing I wish to make very clear here is that this cannot be a one-off.
That's right.
I said to Debbie earlier that quite frankly, we need to have this same panel with more white people who have the problem. I'd ask Chief Ramsey just to catalog this because he and I probably know the immediate answer. But anybody in the audience, name for me the number of Black police officers in the course of their duty that killed a white person about anything. Just name any of them, anywhere in this nation. And when I taught police officers in the criminal justice system of Nova Southeastern University, I would say to them rather repeatedly, almost all of them were white, seeking master's degrees. And I would say to them, they should take their lead from their Black officer colleagues who don't go around killing people. Now, some of that has changed over the years, and I'm talking about a substantial period in the past. Uncharacteristically, I'm going to give up the mic and say pointedly that what we need is transparency and accountability. And that leads with those of us that are in office, period. We have a responsibility to our respective communities to make sure not only police departments, but all of us that interact with police departments do the things that are vitally necessary. Some of you, particularly those of you in Broward, know that Debbie and I formulated the kind of group that contemplated high school and middle class, not middle class, but the class of those that are in middle school. We brought them in so that we could hear their views. We simply must do this, and we must capture this momentum that's ongoing. Let me stop there because there's so many panelists and I want to make sure we get an opportunity to hear from everybody. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you so much, Congressman Hastings. Congresswoman Castor.
Well, good evening from Tampa. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks, Debbie and Alcee, for organizing this important town hall. And it's great to see Rep. Deutch and Commissioner Simmons. I look forward to meeting you, and a special shout out to Tampa Bay's own Leon Russell. It's great to see you, Leon. So I'm very interested in building confidence and trust between the community I represent and law enforcement. And yes, it's important to do the federal legislation, justice and policing, that'll ban chokeholds and require body cameras and require training. But I agree with Commissioner Simmons. This needs to be a broader discussion. If we're truly going to move Florida forward, we've got to look at public education. And here in Florida, what I've seen over the past 10 to 20 years out of Tallahassee is a resegregation of our public schools, a legislature that's been diverting money, sending it to private for-profit charter schools and leaving our public school kids in the lurch. I see it when it comes to affordable health care. You know, if COVID has done anything, it's shined an unfortunate light on health disparities between African Americans and others. And listening to experts recently, it's become clear to me that these aren't race-based disparities. These are disparities caused by decades, hundreds of years of racism, barriers to access to care. And here again in Florida, we're one of 14 states that are left that we have not expanded Medicaid. And that means that we're subsidizing healthcare for other states, and our people are not getting the healthcare that they need. And that includes mental health care. Our incomes are lower, our wages are lower. There's greater income inequality here. We've talked about voting and the really colossal disenfranchisement, this Jim Crow relic that Florida voters had to stand up and repeal. And still to this day, Governor DeSantis is fighting it in the courts and called it just yesterday a corruption of our electoral system. That is so wrong. And folks all across the state have got to stand up and say no. It also means environmental justice and climate change. You know, communities of color are disproportionately burdened by dirty air and dirty water. And if we're going to build a cleaner, healthier, more prosperous, more equal society here, we have got to we've got to embed environmental justice in everything we do. So we have a long to-do list, but looking at our panelists and allies from across the state, I'm confident that we can get there. The arc of justice, it's a long march. It's a long march, but we're all going to get there. And this is a moment, I agree, to turn it into a movement.
Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks so much, Congressman Castor. Congressman Deutch.
Thanks so much for this opportunity, Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz and Congressman Hastings. Thanks for doing this. It's great to see you, Congresswoman Castor, and what an honor, Leon Russell, to be on a panel with you. And
been a while.
Yeah, Commissioner Simmons, congratulations on the new baby, and congratulations on the really important work that you did today in taking this conversation to Coral Springs in a really significant way. I also want to thank General Holder and Commissioner Ramsey and everyone who's watching. We're in the midst of what is clearly a long overdue conversation about change in our society, and we're confronting this long history of racism and injustice and oppression, and it's become ingrained in certain segments of the society. And we now have this unique opportunity coming out of this horrific tragedy to bring about long overdue change to policing in Florida and across the country. For too long, we've failed to redress the injustices that plagued racial minorities that the Black community has been forced to endure And there have been efforts over and over. There's been this ongoing call for relief, and now we have to respond. The deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Rayshard Brooks are just some of the latest reminders of the desperate need for law enforcement reform. We've got to implement meaningful reforms that will make our communities safer and rebuild trust between law enforcement and those that they have sworn to serve and protect, and to do so in a way to address systemic racism. Yesterday, we spent more than 12 hours in the House Judiciary Committee debating the Justice and Policing Act. And as Kathy points out, it'll end chokeholds and make it easier for victims of police violence to seek justice. It'll reform training and impose national standards and require body and dashboard cams. It's comprehensive and it's bold, but the bill is just a start. As Alcee said, this can't be a one-off. We've got to take a critical look at the systemic problems that support injustice in our society. We've got to reform and repair the education system, housing, jobs, infrastructure in racial and ethnic minority communities, and funding's got to be directed toward mental health care services and eradicating homelessness. All of this needs to be on the agenda right now. Too often, armed law enforcement officers are called in to handle situations that they're not well suited to handle, that are only made worse by their presence. And too often, officers who abuse their power are able to avoid accountability. And the sad result is that too often it is Black families who have paid the price. So I want to reaffirm my commitment to fighting for comprehensive policing reform, but beyond that, to continuing this work that Debbie, you and Alcee are such incredible leaders on, to finally provide a forum like this that can lead to meaningful relief for our communities. And I look forward to learning from my fellow panelists and the conversations that will take place tonight. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks, Ted.
Thank you so much to my colleagues and to our community and national leaders. Now I want to ask you to focus on one key question, and that is this. What would you say after the number of weeks we've been through the aftermath of the George Floyd murder and Breonna Taylor and the murder in Atlanta? What would, if you had one thing that you knew you could change right now to impact racial justice, what would that be? We'll start with
getting rid of Donald Trump.
Well, I can't say I'm surprised at that answer from our dear friend.
I'd go a little bit farther than that, though. I think there was a time when some of us were younger, running around in Tallahassee in particular, when Congresswoman Castor's mother was in the legislature, and when people truly worked across the aisle and they were concerned about the issues that impacted real Floridians. We had just gotten rid of what was known as the pork choppers. Some of us understand what that means.
Mm-hmm.
And quite frankly, the pork choppers have come back. There was a demonstration of that in the subcommittee, Mr. Deutch, that you were sitting on yesterday. A relic of the pork choppers popped his head up. It is time for us as a people to understand that policy impacts everybody's lives, whether it's how much money we make, how much education we get, where we stand economically throughout the system, what our healthcare system will be. We have to have policymakers who are truly concerned about the good of those they govern. And that means that we have to all exercise the franchise. We have to vote, and we have to turn people out who are not concerned about anything other than power.
You're here.
And if I may, for me, I think what the Black community needs, especially historically Black neighborhoods and cities, need a comprehensive economic package that helps fight off gentrification and other things that reduce Black home ownership and land ownership in this country. Every day, developers are buying houses and land from under Black folks that have no other choice but to accept that vast amount of money because they've never seen anything like that before. And then next thing you know, they give up their land, and then they get priced out of the area that they've grown up in, and then we're losing more of that history. We talked about the fact that that guy in the White House was originally planning to have, his first, I don't know what to call it, but first event in Tulsa, which was the site of the Greenwood Massacre, right? And, the fact that that community never got a chance to be rebuilt ever again, something so beautiful like that is a problem. And so we're losing these neighborhoods and these communities at an alarming rate. And we got to do a better job of protecting them because Black home ownership and land ownership is at a very, very low rate. And at the end of the day, when you have your tax dollars and different things, they aren't going to the programs that help support you. They're going elsewhere. And so we got to do better with that.
And I think that's a good one, Commissioner Simmons. Yeah. I'll go back to public education. Here we are 60 plus years after Brown versus Board of Education. And it seemed like for a while we were on a path to meet the promise of free and equal public schools all across America. But there have been stops and starts. And I can't say today, especially here in Florida, due to the damage done by the Florida legislature and Republican governors, we're farther away from that than we were years ago. And one example is look at the federal Department of Education and what Betsy DeVos has recently suggested. In the CARES Act, we've sped emergency money back to our public schools, and here in Florida, we're going to get billions of dollars. But Betsy DeVos and USDOE says, no, you don't have to follow the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and Title I requirements that we wrote into the CARES Act. She says, I'm going to issue guidance that you can share that money with private schools that do not have to uphold our very important civil rights laws and how they operate throughout public education. So if I could do one thing today, it would be to go back and do everything we can to meet the promise of high quality, free and equal public schools so that the color of your skin and your zip code doesn't determine the quality of your education.
Deb, I'll forego any further commentary so that we can get back on track. We have a lot of panelists. So
we do, and just one more with Congressman Deutch.
I'll be quick.
I do this to Ted all the time.
Poor Ted.
It's hard to speak after Alcee just told me I shouldn't, but I would, if there's just one thing, we can't let policing reform be the end of our legislative efforts. Right. We've got to continue to reform the criminal justice system from that horrible road from slavery to Jim Crow to segregation to mass incarceration now has left us in this place that's caused so much damage to families and to communities, and it prevents people from getting jobs and prevents people from voting and prevents people from providing, and it costs people their homes. We have to reform our criminal justice system and do it in a really meaningful way.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the key message from this panel is clearly that fighting systemic racism is going to take a systemic solution across every category that impacts people of color's lives. And the discrimination that has accumulated, really has to be broken down, brick by brick. And that's what's so essential. It's why I wanted to have each of you ask that question, so we could start seeing the building blocks and a pathway to break out of this systemic pattern. So thank you so much to our first panelists. I know many of you have to go back to markups where we're all in the process of preparing to go back to Washington at the end of next week. And to Mr. Russell, Commissioner Simmons, my colleague Congressman Hastings, Congresswoman Castor and Deutch, Thank you so much for your service. It's an honor to work with you and to call all of you friends.
Happy Juneteenth, y'all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Now we'll bring back Commissioner Ramsey. I want him to answer a quick question, and then we're also going to start the next panel after that. Commissioner Ramsey, if you can just briefly talk about, the so many of the reforms from the 21st Century Policing Commission that you chaired under President Obama really never had a chance to get off the ground. So can you just briefly touch on some of the key reforms that we really need to implement, because we really have a roadmap for the direction we need to go in battling racial injustice?
Well, as you know, that report, which we didn't have a lot of time to put it together, but I'm very proud of it because I think we did a very good job, quite frankly, to get something to President Obama that he was looking for, and that was some concrete recommendations that people could actually act upon. But of the 6 areas that we addressed in that report, building trust and legitimacy was number 1. And we intentionally made that the very first pillar that we addressed, because without that, it's very difficult to do anything else. We have to find a way to build trust in the communities that we serve, particularly our more challenged communities, because that's where the tension exists. And that's not a new phenomenon, it's historical. When I was a kid growing up, I grew up on the south side of Chicago in a very challenged neighborhood. And whereas I was fortunate enough not to have any negative experiences with police, I do know of friends that did. And so that is critically important. There was some work done on the report. I mean, many departments did try to implement. When the administration changed, of course, then things really changed. General Holder mentioned pattern and practice investigations. There was another program out of the COPS office called Collaborative Reform. I actually got the Philadelphia Police Department in that. We were the 3rd jurisdiction to go into that. And it's very similar to a consent decree, only the court's not involved. You invite justice in, they come in, they take a look at your department, they make recommendations. I think we had 351 recommendations. And then you work with them in order to implement those. So there were a lot of things going on. When I heard the president say not long ago that the Obama administration did nothing could be further from the truth. There was a lot of work done. In fact, after I retired, myself, along with 4 others that were part of the president's task force, actually formed a company to actually help agencies and cities that want to reform their police departments move forward with recommendations from the task force report. So there's a lot that's happened.
Thank you so much. Now I want to begin to introduce our second panel. Our next group of panelists will also provide a brief opening remarks, and then we'll go to Q&A, and Commissioner Ramsey will join us there again. Rodney Hurst is a civil rights activist and historian from the Jacksonville area. Representative Al Wasserman represents North Florida from Jacksonville to the Tallahassee area. Congresswoman Frederica Wilson represents parts of Miami-Dade and Broward counties. Congressman Darren Soto represents parts of Orlando, the parts of the Orlando area and the surrounding suburbs. And Congresswoman Donna Shalala represents parts of Miami-Dade County. Because of her time constraints, having a hard stop in a few moments, we'll start it off with the opening remarks of Congresswoman Shalala.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I'll just make a few remarks. My colleagues are very distinguished, and I know I'm in a great company. I want to talk about the disparities and about the fact that we created them. We created them with government policies, with our behavior, and until we close every gap based on fairness, racial equity, social justice, we'll continue to fear, mistrust, the anger, and the killing. We need to fund and close the deep disparities in quality health care, in education, in access to well-paying jobs, in childcare and family leave and nutrition, in transportation and in housing, and in community safety. This is not just a criminal justice issue. This stretches across every institution in our society. And until we recognize our own responsibility for creating the structures that have created the deep racism in our society, we will not make the kind of progress that we promised. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We'll go back to Rodney Hurst.
Thank you, Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz. We have to deal with racism in American society. White American racism is based on the total disrespect for the hue of black skin. And white privilege and white supremacy is based on the hue of white skin. We can all see the results as they are played out daily in America. Yet, police disrespect, police brutality, and police murders, as well as the wanton violence on the rise against blacks, are not new, and they are not coincidences. I often hear whites and some blacks say, why do we always have to talk about racism? Let's leave those racist things in the past and let's move on from here. It's always interesting to hear those words from whites who don't want to hear about their racism and blacks who are too stupid to understand their history. Racism controls our lives. There is no let's move on from here when the same racist epithets, nigger, jungle bunny, niggers ain't acting like colored people for NAACP, I heard while sitting in at white lunch counters, walking picket lines, marching, kneeling in, and protesting for black human dignity and respect continue to be heard today. There is no let's move on from here when we see the same rope today, emblematic of violence and death, and used to lynch more than 4,000 blacks, as documented by the Equal Justice Initiative, in the form of bullets and police nightsticks. There is no let's move on from here when the same racism we saw called police brutality, police violence, and police murders perpetrated against blacks throughout the civil rights movement with impunity continue today. So no, we cannot move on from here. We cannot leave things in the past. I cannot imagine such a likelihood under any consideration. Justice is not blind. Justice is a racist.
Thank you, Mr. Hurst. Congresswoman Wilson.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz, and to all of my colleagues, my wonderful colleagues who have joined us. And Mr. Hurst, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you. The tension that exists between police and black boys and men is real. It's a tension that has existed since the end of slavery. And you know, at one time there were no police, no armies. We only had armies. There were no police. And then after slavery, they said, get off our land, leave, go. But we have nowhere to go. So slaves began to roam the country, looking for food, looking for shelter. And we created what we call the slave patrols. And the slave patrols' entire mission was to hunt black men, hang them from trees, remove their scrotums, show them off in the marketplaces, and you would ride through the countries in the South, and you would see black men hanging from trees with their scrotum. So this hate generated from the muscular build of the black slave and the slave patrol being intimidated by that. So this has come all the way down to the present, and we still have that tension. And that easing of tension has to be community level easing. And so that's why I created the 5,000 Role Models of Excellence in Miami-Dade County. And last week, 24 police chiefs and 200 police officers knelt down for 8 minutes and 46 seconds in solidarity with 200 black boys commemorating the death of Mr. Floyd. So when you find that kind of action, you know that you are breaking barriers and you're finding a way so our boys won't be looked at as caricatures of real men, but they would be looked at as real men. When people lock the car doors and standing on the corner across the street, if you approach them, you get out of the elevator if they get in. So we're trying to build good men. And because of that, I have filed a bipartisan solution in Congress and bicameral solution that has huge support. It's called the Commission on the Social Status of Black Men and Boys. And we will be looking at all of the disparities, systemic conditions impacting Black males like homicide rates, arrest and incarceration rates, health issues, racism, poverty, violence, fatherhood, mentorship, drug abuse, death rates, dispute to income, wealth levels, school performance in all grade levels, including post-secondary level and college. And we will also develop solutions and policies to eradicate them and to move these boys forward. There is a critical need to implement major policing reforms, but we cannot ignore the underlying causes of the racist acts by both police officers and everyday Americans that have needlessly taken so many lives. So we're at a pivotal point in history that I pray people will one day look back on and know that we seized the moment. We seized the moment to make life better for Black people. There's too much racism in America today. Frederick Douglass said, "It is easier to build strong children than it is to repair broken men." And that's what the Commission on Social Studies of Black Men and Boys will do.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Wilson. Congressman Soto.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz, for having me, and it's an honor to be with Mr. Hurst, with my colleagues, Representative Wilson, Shalala, and Lawson. We had a march here in Kissimmee in response to the murder of George Floyd, and it was peaceful. We had civil rights leaders from the NAACP, from Black Lives Matter, local law enforcement, including our local sheriff, Les Gibson, a Democrat. And we had a wonderful set of speeches talking about the needs in our community to heal racism. And we had a huge amount of my fellow Puerto Ricans and generally the Hispanic community attend and march alongside with our African-American community and Anglo communities. And I do want to say that the Hispanic community here in Florida stands with our African-American brothers and sisters, much like the Congressional Hispanic Caucus stands with the Congressional Black Caucus and others in pursuing these justice reforms. After that, we were very pleased to see the House start the ball rolling with the Justice and Policing Act of 2020, which gave us a real great set of ideas from the Congressional Black Caucus and the Judiciary Committee to start an important conversation. And that's what we had next, a conversation on equality and justice in America. And we started with a very brief intro and simply had our civil rights leaders enter into a discussion where the elected officials simply listened. So we had members of Black Lives Matter, of NAACP, of our local educators, our criminal defense attorneys, and local Democratic African-American leaders talk about some of the issues going on, followed by brief statements by our local sheriff responding to certain issues brought up, and closing with elected officials doing our best to make sure we're listening. And that's really what my question is to the panel, knowing how important communication, listening, understanding is if there's any advice that you have as to how we could better communicate with our constituents in order to bring change and action both in Florida and across our nation.
Thank you, Congressman Soto. Congressman Lawson?
Schultz. First, my heart goes out to the families who have lost loved ones as a result of police brutality. We had a turning point in America, and facing these three crises that are very prevalent today, which is very serious. That's the economy, social, and health. Those are dangerous combinations that we are faced with today. As the protests start to die down, now is the time for real action. We must look at policy and reconstruct the system to ensure that not just a moment, but a movement. I'm proud to be one of the co-sponsors of the Justice for Policing Act. This powerful piece of legislation bans the use of chokeholds and no-knock warrants, which took the lives of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Eric Gardner. It would always require the use of dashboard cameras in police cars that required federal uniformed police officers to wear body cameras. The bill also helps the equipment made for a wall, take the equipment made for war off the street. There's no reason for it to really be there. We need transparency and accountability when police use force against citizens. I am sure that many of you have extraordinary respect for the police as I do. And that's one of the reasons why we need to make sure that they get the proper training that they really need. I believe the majority of the officers are great people, but for those few who abuse the power for criminal action, they must be held accountable. Maybe it starts at a training level, whether it's more time in the academy, additional training on how to de-escalate the situation without taking someone's life, as we have seen over and over again in the past episodes that occurred. You know, since 2014, there has been an average of 1,000 fatal police involvement shooting nationwide each year. Our sons and daughters should have the opportunity to grow up in a world where they are not seen as the enemy. We do not even enemy. As we look to move forward, Florida and the rest of America forward, real relationship is needed. And I think that we can really have that. The Trump chooses to divide America, to divide policing with our citizens. That's something that we cannot afford. That is why we need to change it right now. I look forward to working on this legislation and continue to make sure that our people feel safe with the respect they need and change the way we police in this country.
Thank you, Congressman Lawson. It's really been a privilege to serve in 3 legislative bodies with you over the last almost 30 years. So it's really wonderful to have you. Now we'll move into the Q&A session for this panel. Congresswoman Shalala has a hard stop in a few minutes, and so I'm going to go to her for the first question, and then we'll proceed with the rest of the panel. Congresswoman Shalala, Donna, as America's longest serving Secretary of Health and Human Services, you served during the Clinton administration. I want to zero in on your expertise here. Can you help us understand the racial disparities in health outcomes during the COVID-19 pandemic? I want to get a sense from you about the greater challenges that people of color generally face in healthcare, like access to healthcare, which we know is a systemic problem, or dealing with implicit bias from healthcare providers, for example. What part has his systemic inequality in healthcare played in creating these disparities?
Well, you know, it's ended up with larger proportions of minorities, African Americans in particular, dying, getting infected and dying because the healthcare system has clearly discriminated not only in the lack of health insurance, but even with health insurance, the lack of access to healthcare and to healthcare providers, and simultaneously all the other things that go around it, nutrition, public education. The fact is that health is related to almost everything else. And the lack of providers who are culturally sensitive that come from communities. We cannot underestimate the education of doctors, nurses, and the need for people that understand the communities that they're working with, not just understand, respect the communities that they're working in. And this has been a decades-long struggle. In addition to identifying each racial ethnic group has a set of, often a set of diseases they're more susceptible to. And the healthcare system is not nimble enough to make those kinds of adjustments and to anticipate the issues that are going to arise. But there are deep gaps in our insurance and our coverage system that we simply must close. But closing them without representatives in the healthcare system that are respectful, that come from the communities, and understand how to work with communities.
Dealing with implicit bias so that we don't have people of color when they present with the same healthcare challenge that a white person does, and they face dismissal and being treated less respectfully and less seriously than a white patient. That really has to end. And I think we have to fund training and cultural. We've got to have grant programs and the continuing medical education so that we can make sure that we can make those changes.
Yeah, let me add one more thing. The deep distrust in many among many parts of the minority communities because of things like the Tuskegee experiment.
Right.
It's not just Donald Trump that's anti-science. It's actual experience in the African American community, and we have to recognize the history and have a strategy to overcome that.
Absolutely, and I know you have a hard stop in a moment, so thank you so much for joining us. And now I'm going to throw a question out to the rest of my colleagues, and then Mr. Hurst will come back to you. Congressman Soto, I know you had mentioned that you had a virtual town hall on this subject in your district, and I think all of the members, I'd love to hear you talk about, what are some ways that we as members of Congress can engage with our constituents on the issues of racial justice?
Well, I can tell you first, a lot of our town hall was simply listening, and we got some great ideas that we passed along to the Congressional Black Caucus and to the Judiciary Committee, and having law enforcement simply on the phone listening to issues, complaints, reforms was a really important part of that, because I think we do a lot more talking, and that's why I'm here, mostly to listen as well, to make sure that we can make the right decisions, whether it's economic justice, criminal justice, or whether it's healthcare justice or environmental justice. There's a lot of reckoning that needs to happen.
Thank you. Congresswoman Wilson, I'd actually rather have you talk a little bit more about your pride and joy, the 5,000 Role Models of Excellence project. I know your boys, so many of us have gotten to meet them. I know over many, many years. Can you talk a little bit about that project and the impact that it's made in the lives of African-American young men over the years?
Well, it has grown to over 1 million children because they're all over the United States of America and all over the world. And we teach them and train them from 3rd grade all the way through high school, and then we send them to college. So they know how to deal with the police. That tension is not there anymore because through the years, they have visited the prisons, they have visited jails, they have sat in on courtroom dealings, they have watched people being sentenced for murder to the electric chair. They have done it all. So they understand, and they have voiced their concerns to the police, and the police have voiced theirs. We have published a brochure called the Police and Youth Brochure, How to Behave When Stopped by the Police. We also have one called Know the Law. And you have to know the laws in order to survive. Because one thing we don't want our children to do is wind up with a criminal record for a teeny thing that will ruin them for the rest of their lives. So mass incarceration, guiding them, teaching them education. If there's one thing I want to say before we leave here, we've got to find a way to hire more Black men in elementary schools for our children. They need Black teachers.
Thank you so much. And Congressman Lawson, Tallahassee, your hometown, is home to one of the nation's foremost historically Black colleges, and they have such an incredible history of leadership. Can you talk about the importance of HBCUs in this country why it's so important for us to make sure that we not only continue their funding, but increase it and use the HBCU system to provide more opportunities and pathways to success for people of color all across this country.
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. HBCUs play a significant role in providing not only leaders throughout America, but in the critical areas in science and technology, you know, and PhDs, producing a large number of PhDs in this country to help move America forward as we right now are looking for a cure for the pandemic that is actually going on. You know, it is incredible because they reach out to those communities and people like myself that probably didn't have the opportunity to go to other schools to give you the opportunity that you probably wouldn't get. But one thing I want to say, and it's coming upon all of us, I'm in Jacksonville tonight, and tomorrow I'll be meeting with the sheriff, which is very significant. And I meet with the sheriffs throughout the district. And I think it's extremely important that we talk to them about their training and what is happening, things that you will see happening from Mr. Johnson that got killed here. It was a FAMU student that got killed here in Jacksonville. But we need to keep this dialogue with law enforcement, you know, because it's important that we don't just overlook things and that they know that we are sensitive and that we are working to let them comment on the bill that'll be coming up next week, you know, throughout the district. So they have some input and see what we're trying to do. It's not to get rid of the police, but what it is to make sure they have the proper training. Because, you know, when something happens, you're not going to call Ghostbusters. You're going to call the police, you know. And so we want people to feel comfortable. In the 60s, I was not afraid of the police. But here in the 2020, I'm kind of reluctant, you know. But and I see Rodney Hurst over there was involved in the 60s with X-House Saturday, the 60th anniversary that is actually coming up. It's coming up at the same time you have in the Republican Convention in Duval in Jacksonville on the same very date, just a couple of blocks from where I am right here tonight. So as a result, but we need this dialogue more so than ever with the police. I admire what Congressman Wilson is doing. I'm a part of the Black Kids Role Models, and she makes me wear my red tie, you know, every week and approach me if I don't have it, you know. So, and I'm about to leave out the chamber and try to run home to get it. But the most critical thing that we have is communication. And I know with communication, we can make a change. And we got to let them know that we have different kind of people out there now. I was speaking last night at a memorial service in Tallahassee with thousands of people there. And they are marching and they're not going to stop. They're going to continue. So we need to let them know that we hear them. And we got to have this dialogue with our police officers. I think that's incredible.
Thank you so much. And I really, lastly, before we wrap up this panel, I want to ask Commissioner Ramsey and Mr. Hurst to answer this question. What do you both think? Certainly the Justice and Policing Act, I'm sure you believe is a good first step, you know, solid step in the right direction. But what do you think should be Congress's next steps to really make sure that this, as so many have said, isn't a one-off and one and done, and then, you know, everybody can just go home?
Mr. Hurst?
One of the most important things is in our educational system, because one of the cornerstones of racism is disrespect. Mm-hmm. Disrespect when this Christian country thought of Black folk as property, and how based on the color of our skin, we were thought of as a chair or a table, something that you just discarded. We have to teach in our schools African American history to the extent where white students and Black students understand the relevant and the salient contributions of Blacks to American history. In the academic arena, they say that if it's not written down, it did not happen. And racist textbook authors and historians have made it a point not to write about the contributions of blacks. So a white student picks up a book and reads about the contribution of his ancestors, and a black student cannot read anything about contributions by those who look like him or her. That makes the playing field eternally uneven. And even though they have left it up to the states to come up with an African American curriculum, African American history is still not incorporated and taught in our schools today. And unless we understand what respect is all about, we're going to continue to have those problems. That respect has to start in part in the academic arena. So in elementary, middle, senior high school, and in colleges and universities, they teach who black folk are and what they have done for the American development of this American country.
Incredibly important. Commissioner Ramsey?
I think the next step for Congress would be to see to it that whatever reforms are ultimately put in place, whatever you pass, it has to be implemented. It has to happen. We have a huge void in our Justice Department now, the U.S. Department of Justice. They, in my opinion, have lost a great deal of credibility over the past couple of years. General Holder mentioned, pattern and practice investigations, collaborative reform, all those kinds of things. And I know that in many jurisdictions now, state attorney generals are actually stepping up to make sure that departments are being held accountable. And so passing legislation is part of it, but it doesn't mean anything if departments are not held accountable to implementing those reforms. You have to hold people accountable. And if you aren't able to do that, even if that means, and the best way of doing it is probably by tying funding to it. Quite frankly, money tends to get the attention of folks. And so that's one way, but you definitely have to hold people accountable to make sure these changes are actually implemented. And lastly, you talk about racism and you hear this whole, there's, just a few bad apples or there's not whatever. When you have a system where people with those attitudes can hide for years and decades and do what they do and still have that job, that's a problem. And so you may not find it written in policy, you're not going to find it in training or whatever, but there is a culture there where there are people who have no business being a police officer at all, yet they're able to survive. And they have complaint after complaint after complaint, and they still manage to keep the job. If you had that many complaints, 17, 18 complaints over a span of a few years, you would not have your job.
That's right.
There's no reason for them to have theirs. And so we've got to root that out, but we got to be serious about doing it. And once they're out, you got to keep them out, which means you do need that national database. You can't allow people to go from one jurisdiction to another to just stay one step ahead of any kind of accountability.
Yeah. In short, we can't be about tell me. We have to be about show me.
Right.
And so we're years and years and years of talking about what we're going to do. Now it's time to do it and make sure it happens. And that's what this is all about. And it's what the election will be all about. Thank you so much to our second panel. Congresswoman Wilson, I know you have a committee markup that's going to continue late into the evening, and to my other colleagues, we're all hard at work from home headquarters here, and we'll move on to the next panel. Thank you so much for your participation, and it's just going to be an honor to continue to work with you on making sure that we can really bring about significant change in this fight for racial justice. So that concludes our second panel of the evening. Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, who represents parts of Central Florida and serves on the House Ways and Means Committee, will moderate our next panel following this important video.
Before Donald Trump comes to Tulsa, remember what real leaders sound like.
Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice.
Too often we honor swagger and bluster and the wielders of force. Too often we excuse those who are willing to build their own lives on the shattered dreams of other human beings.
Now those who divide speak.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow and segregation forever.
I agree that looters ought to be shot, yes. On sight? On sight. The Negro and white citizen of this state are against the breakdown of law and order.
You have to dominate the streets. Please don't be too nice. Very fine people on both sides.
When you hear leaders speak, you know who they are, who they represent, and what kind of America they'll create. The Lincoln Project is responsible for the content of this advertising.
The tension that exists between black boys and the police is generational. It's been with us since slavery. And that's why I've introduced the Commission on the Social Status of Black Men and Boys to ease that tension and give communities solutions on how to do it properly.
The killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others are a tragic reminder that racism is very much alive in the United States. These deaths are the most recent in the long history of black men and women who have been wrongfully killed at the hands of our police. In the past few weeks, we've seen protests erupt across the country. People are angry, and they should be. For generations, black and brown people have been promised equal opportunity. They've been promised respect, humanity, and justice, but they've seen little progress. Our democracy provides the sacred right to criticize our government. I'm proud of the thousands of young people and older people, people in our community and our state who have peacefully exercised that right.
We have to ban chokeholds and make them illegal all across this country. That you cannot obstruct, as a law enforcement officer, the airway of an accused individual. We have to make sure that we require de-escalation practices to be part of training, so that an officer doesn't go to DEFCON 5 as soon as they encounter someone they think might have broken the law. We have to make sure that we have a national database, so that when you have a cop who's been fired from their job because they engaged in some heinous practice, that a future police agency can look them up in that national database, see why they were fired, and not just have them hop from police force to police force. And we have to make sure that we have the ability to have everyone in America treated equitably and fairly, and not judged by police when they encounter them by the color of their skin.
I am feeling once again inspired. And what has particularly inspired me is the degree to which folks are thinking strategically, practically, at a very detailed level about where are the places where you can make change and what are the practical solutions backed up by research, backed up by data, backed up by experience that allows us to create a set of communities that are safe and just, safe and fair, safe and non-discriminatory, and that is possible. And I think that one of the things that has been raised is the fact that we don't have the capacity to eradicate 400 years of racism in one fell swoop. So if we think that this is a seismic shift, I hope people don't feel like, well, nothing's going to happen once we figure this out. As I've been known to quote Dr. King, I've said frequently, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We bend it. All of you have bent it over the last 4, 5, 6, 10 years. And we are seeing the fruits of those labors in the degree of awareness that is out there.
Good evening. What an incredible video. Thank you all so much for inviting me here to be with you tonight. This is such an innovative way to bring together our state's leaders to talk about an incredibly important issue affecting millions of Americans. Thank you to my friends and colleagues, Debbie and Alcee, for hosting tonight's event. I'm really honored to be here. Hi, I'm Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, and I represent Central Florida in the U.S. House of Representatives. You know, as members of Congress, our most fundamental responsibility is to listen to the people we represent. And that's a big part of tonight's event. We're bringing together community leaders and affected Floridians to share your experiences in vision for racial justice, and to share with us your thoughts on best practices that will improve our law enforcement systems in the U.S. There's a deeply rooted problem in our country when it comes to the treatment of African Americans by some members of the law enforcement community. And as a woman of color myself and as an immigrant, I know it's not easy to be different in America sometimes, and I can personally attest to that. I grew up in a rural, predominantly white area where my family and I really stuck out. And I'm familiar with the uneasiness that my difference could cause. The awkward glances, that uncomfortable body language, the inherent distrust people unknowingly display and feel. And it's tough, especially when you're just a kid trying to make your way through a public school system. But I will never and can never fully grasp the pain and righteous anger that the Black community across America feels right now. I do, however, share their anguish. I've been listening to their experiences, and I've pledged to be an ally for positive change. If we're going to heal as a country, it's got to start with us firmly stating what we believe. If we're going to live up to America's foundational creed that every person has the right to life and liberty, then we must unapologetically state that Black lives matter and do better as a society and country. As a member of Congress, I'm focused on the swift and serious steps that Congress can take to improve the status quo, which is unacceptable. I understand that we confront the fierce urgency of now, and I'm working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to develop and enact legislation designed with one goal in mind: to ensure that what happened to George Floyd and too many African Americans before him does not ever happen again. And while my fellow Democrats and I are working in Congress to identify and pass legislation that helps us create a more perfect union, this crisis cannot be solved with just legislation. We as a society must listen to one another, especially those who are different from us. And dialogue, I believe, builds empathy. Empathy builds trust, and trust builds peace. So each of us has to do our part to heal. And that's why I'm so glad to be here tonight, to listen, to learn, to adapt, and to heal. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Once again, I'm Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. And now I'd like to introduce all of our panelists. We'll start with introductions, and then I'll recognize each panelist for a short opening. Following the opening statements, we'll start with the Q&A session. And on to the introductions. First up, I have State Rep Tracy Davis, a champion for education and as a former supervisor of elections in Duval County. She's fought to protect voting rights and modernize voting systems. We're also joined by three of my friends and colleagues in Congress: Representative Val Demings, who represents Orlando with me, and Representative Debbie Murkisell Powell and Representative Lois Frankel, both from South Florida. And so we'll start with some opening remarks. First up, Rep Davis, would you like to give us your opening?
Thank you, Congresswoman Murphy. I'm so glad to be here with this elated group of ladies. But just like the other panelists said, this has been an unbearable year. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and a countless number of others. There's so much that others can take for granted that we can't as Black people. Black people can't simply do. You can't simply seek help after a car accident while being Black. You can't listen to music in a parking lot while being Black. You can't wear a hoodie while being Black. You can't be a 13-year-old boy while being Black. You can't either enter your own home while Black. You can't be a 6-year-old and throw a tantrum while Black. And you can't sit in your own apartment while Black. The message is loud and clear, and you simply cannot live in America while being Black. How can we build a future that allows us to simply live while we're Black? Black, white, brown, and everyone in between. It is my belief that no matter who you are, your life has meaning. And each of us, every action, every choice, and every word has an effect that creates ripples in society's collective ocean. It all matters. However, in Florida, we have systems of injustice. Tonight, we'll talk about racial injustices, but Florida has systems of injustices that must be broken down and dissolved. Our school system, resegregation of schools, our healthcare system, the health disparities among African Americans, as well as our clemency rule system. And that starts with the appeal of Amendment 4. So I look forward to the conversation. I've heard many things over and over again, like accountability and transparency. And I know this panel will continue to talk about it. But we must break down these systems in order to accomplish the goals we're trying to accomplish when it comes to policing African Americans in this country.
Thank you so much, Rep. Davis, for your passionate opening. And now I'd like to recognize my colleagues for some opening remarks. Congresswoman Demings. Congresswoman, you may need to unmute your...
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Representative Murphy, for moderating this very important discussion tonight. I also want to thank the state representative who represents the place where I was born.
Yes.
Representative Davis, it's so good to see you as well. I'm honored to serve with my other two colleagues, Debbie McCarso-Powell and Lois Frankel, and then to my wonderful, so well-respected brother in blue, the former commissioner of Philadelphia, Chuck Ramsey. What a very important discussion we are having tonight. And let me say this, Representative Davis, I thank you so much for calling the names of the persons who have been on our hearts and our minds for the last few weeks. I can say unequivocally, as a person who served 27 years in law enforcement and as a person who had the honor of serving as the chief of police, what happened to them should not have happened. We're having a discussion about what can we do, what laws, what policies, procedures, what can we do as people who care about this issue, whether legislators or not, to ensure that what happened to them does not happen again. Now, there are some who would try to make this discussion or this moment about us versus them, about the community versus the police. Well, it can never be that, because the community is the police and the police is the community. This is about working hard to build trust, to build relationship, and to hold police accountable when they are engaged in wrongdoing. Everybody deserves to live in safer communities. Black communities are no exception. As I said, some would try to make this about us versus them, but Black communities want to live in safe neighborhoods as well. But this is about police accountability. And when we know better, we should do better. I am very pleased at the legislation that we introduced last week. We marked it up in Judiciary on yesterday, the Justice in Policing Act. And the legislative process is a beginning to really trying to look at some national guidelines, working with the Department of Justice and others to make sure whether you're a 10-person police agency or a 36,000 police agencies, that there are some standards that everyone can abide by that will help law enforcement agencies, but also help them better police each community. So I look forward to this discussion tonight, and Representative Murphy, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Representative Demings, for your powerful words. Next up, Congresswoman Marcus Powell, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, my friend, Representative Murphy. It's such an honor to share this panel with my great friends and Commissioner Ramsey. You know, I'm so grateful that we're having this town hall discussion today, because we need to talk about what actions we need to take. We have heard thousands and thousands of people for more than 18 days now demanding change, asking for justice. And that's exactly what we need to do at the federal level. We have to take together action to live up to our values and our ideals. It's interesting. I was thinking about this just last week. I started my first march just a few years after I had come here from Ecuador, and I was in college, and I was watching the Rodney King trial. And when those police officers were acquitted, we got together, we organized in our school, and all of us came out asking for justice. That was 29 years ago. And now we have George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and just on Friday, not even a week ago, Rayshard Brooks. The pain and the anguish that this country is feeling is vibrant, and they're demanding change. We have to come together at the federal level and confront the crisis head on. We have to have the courage, the will, and the truthfulness to discuss these issues and accept that we are living in a society where there's systemic racism all over our police departments. We have great police officers that come into the police force with great intentions, but there are so many that use excessive force, that have an underlying bias. And so, like my good friend, Representative Val Demings mentioned, as a member of the Judiciary Committee, we took action very quickly following the lead of Congresswoman Karen Bass, who chairs the Congressional Black Caucus, Senators Kamala Harris, Senators Cory Booker, to introduce the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. Now, my constituents in my district, over 1,200 of them, filled out a survey, and 89% overwhelmingly support accountability and making sure that we hold police officers accountable. What the people want to see is real changes in police oversight and responsibility for those who fail to uphold the law. They know that justice should be equal for all in the United States. And I can say from experience that law enforcement in Miami and in my district, they're making changes. They're trying. I have met with them, and I commend the large number of officers who are working to serve the people. But accountability means transparency, and we need these meaningful changes to build trust in our communities. That starts with working on the front end to reform police practices and addressing the systemic racism that's ingrained in our society and in our government. And this conversation is just the beginning of that. Our federal and state law enforcement agencies need to enact reforms that are responsive to the nation's police. We need to take action that ends racial profiling, bans chokeholds, and sets a standard that use of force should be used only as a last resort. I'm proud that last night we passed through the committee the George Floyd and Policing Act, because this is the first step to make real change in police reform. It may not correct the injustices that we saw in the past, but it is a first step in changing the police culture for the future. So I am proud to work with my friends, my good friends, my colleagues, Representative Murphy, Representative Demings. Thank you to Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Congressman Hastings for putting together this town hall. And I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Rep. Murkisel-Powell, for your inspiring words. Congresswoman Frankel, you have the floor.
Thank you. It's an honor to join this esteemed panel tonight for a conversation on racial justice. Our nation's in pain as we mourn Black Americans taken from their families by police abuse, as we hear the anguish of Black mothers who fear for the safety of their sons. We know that the deaths we've seen only scratch the surface of the tragic legacy of systemic racism in our nation. As many have said before, in Congress, we're taking action to hold law enforcement accountable, curb brutality, and end racial profiling. And we know that this is an important step and that there is so much more action that is needed in every inch of society. But let me just say that the young peaceful protesters across the country demanding change and justice give us all hope. Let me just conclude my quick remarks with a quote from a very well-known rabbi who marched in Selma with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He said, Morally speaking, there is no limit to the concern one must feel for the suffering of human beings. The indifference to evil is worse than evil itself. That in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. Black Lives Matter. And I yield back.
Thanks so much, Congresswoman Frankel. Those were wise words indeed. Now, thank you all for your great introductions. We'll move now to our Q&A. Our first batch of questions will be for Commissioner Ramsey and Representative Davis. Commissioner Ramsey, can you explain the doctrine of qualified immunity and how this doctrine shields police officers from accountability when they commit misconduct?
Well, I may need a little help on this because I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding of qualified immunity, it really protects officers from civil lawsuits in the performance of their duties, provided, of course, that they're operating within the law, and certainly within policy of their department. You know, I know that's a very controversial issue right now, and I have my own personal thoughts on it, but that's basically what it does. Officers are still subject to be arrested, obviously. Departments are sued all the time. Believe me, both Representative Demings and I both have probably been named in more lawsuits than we even know, because every time a suit is filed against a department, your name is on it. And oftentimes your own legal counsel handles it, and you may not even be notified that your name is on it. So, you know, it's not uncommon at all. But qualified immunity does give officers the ability to do their jobs without fear of being subject to lawsuits, unless, of course, they're operating outside the law. And then obviously the city would not cover them.
Thank you so much for that. And I understand you have a TV engagement after this, so
I do.
Leaving us, but we certainly appreciate you being on with us. And thank you for providing a little clarity for, as you said, an issue that has been a bit controversial. But with that, I'd like to move on to Representative Davis.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You have a good evening. Representative Davis, Governor DeSantis hasn't really spoken much about race and justice issues. What, if anything, do you think will happen in Tallahassee on these issues? Also, I know you recently helped mediate a conversation between law enforcement and activists in Jacksonville. Can you share some of the insights you took away from that dialogue and the importance of creating open lines of communication between the community and the police? How can we even do that with so much animosity and distrust?
So I heard someone giggle. So here we are dealing with Governor DeSantis, who frankly hasn't done much. We have elections coming up, and he just announced that we'll do make a step there. But in dealing with what will happen in Tallahassee, that's a huge question. I can tell you that my caucus is planning on proposing legislation, and I wholeheartedly believe that, like we've spoken tonight, legislation will be implemented or proposed on every level, whether it's local, state, and federal. Some of the things mentioned tonight, we are already planning to propose a national database, excessive use of force, banning the neck restraints and chokeholds, and particularly here for us in Duval County, a citizens review board. We have some around the state, but we want to definitely institute that. So we're looking to make sure that we are proposing legislation that's dealing with the policing of African Americans, people of color, and ensuring that law enforcement are held to the standard that they should be held to. And so we've proposed those pieces of legislation and plan to move forward with them as far as the governor and the administration is concerned. Now, we know that's going to be a fight, but we feel like the time is right, as we all do, and we know that a change has to be made now. The nation is saying to us, we have to make policy changes, and that's what we'll do and fight for in Tallahassee. As far as the connection with the community, we did have hold a community meeting with our sheriff, who was graceful enough to come on with us. We had about 200 community participants, and he had a choice to talk to the community, and the community had a chance to talk to him. And the conversation is everything we're talking about tonight. It was about accountability. It was about transparency. It was about how law enforcement officers deal with people of color, and how the community can better deal with police officers. It was a great takeaway. I heard one of the representatives say that she conducted a survey. We did that as well. And so we had ideas going in of what the community wanted to hear from the sheriff. And it was a start. And we know he was willing, he was able, the community appreciated it, and they appreciated him for wanting to have that conversation. But it was just a start. And there has to be more conversations like that with the police union, more of the police, our administration. So we have to continue those conversations so everyone is at the table. And we just felt like we couldn't continue to talk at our law enforcement without asking them to come to the table and talk to us as a community. And we walked away with a good feeling. We walked away with our sheriff literally committing to us that he would work to release body cam footage sooner. And so we felt like we had a small victory there. So we were glad with that.
Well, congratulations on that victory. And I know that you're just at the start and there's a lot of hard work to be done, but so glad to have you in Tallahassee. And thank you for all that you're doing in Duval as well. Thank you.
And thank you for all of you all.
So next we're going to move to the questions for my colleagues in Congress, and I'll start with Congresswoman Demings. As a former patrol officer, police chief, and as an African-American woman, you bring an invaluable perspective to this conversation. Can you talk about how the reforms included in the Justice and Policing Act, like creating a national police misconduct registry, will help local police chiefs improve community safety? How do you feel about the current movement and the calls for greater police accountability? And did you ever face similar challenges during your time as chief?
Well, Representative Murphy, thank you so much for that question. And if I could just comment on something that Representative Davis said about the conversation. We've solved some of our biggest problems in our nation by just beginning the conversation. And we do have to give people a safe place to have tough conversations. We know that racism has been the ghost in the room for over 400 years. But we have to allow people to come to the table and discuss their hopes, dreams, and fears and systemic racism in a very safe way. So I'm so pleased to hear about the conversation. And you're right, State Representative, it is a start, and that's how problems are solved, by beginning that discussion. I spent 27 years at the Orlando Police Department. I have served in every rank, started out as a patrol officer. I went to the police department after having served as a social worker. I believed after I graduated from college, I could save the world. And so I set out on that mission. As a social worker, I worked with broken families and broken children. I went to the police department with a social worker's attitude and realized that we could not arrest our way out of every problem, that we had to address some of the social ills that cause decay in community in the first place. And if you look at whether it's President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force recommendations, or you look at President Johnson's commission that looked at policing and crime in America, they both said, hire the best police officers, make sure they have the best training, make sure they have the best equipment, but you've got to look at poverty, you got to look at housing, you got to look at substandard education, you got to look at jobs and wages. So it takes the two coming together to build stronger and better communities. Certainly, as a police agency, a relatively large agency with over 1,000 men and women, of course, as a police chief, I've faced issues within the department. Also worked very closely with our union to hold those who engaged in wrongdoing accountable, which sometimes is very challenging for chiefs and sheriffs because, as my colleagues know, and Representative Davis knows, many things that governs how police officers are disciplined, how they're investigated is really codified in state statute, which sometimes differ all over the country. And so we have to be creative in how we develop training programs and discipline programs that really are designed to hold officers accountable. Obviously, we still have a lot of work to do. And that's why I'm so glad at the bill that we're hoping to pass next week, the Justice in Policing Act, that just takes it one step forward in terms of accountability. So thank you for your question.
Well, I'm so glad that you set out to save the world, and through that built a lifetime of professional experience that makes your expertise and opinion and perspectives in this moment so incredibly valuable. So thank you so much for that answer.
Thank you.
Congresswoman Murkazal-Powell, South Florida and the Miami area hosted some of the largest protests across the state in recent weeks. What do you think is fueling the passion and the demands for racial justice in your district?
Thank you for that question. You know, and I was just thinking about this as I was listening to Representative Davis and Representative Demings, that I feel like we have such an opportunity right now. And I think what fueled those protests more than anything were the young people, the young adults that were marching together, Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans, white Americans, but a lot of them represented a new group. And it gave me a lot of hope and optimism that this is a moment that we can really enact real change, bold change in this country, because we have thousands of people that are young, that are marching, that are engaged, that are paying attention. In Miami and in South Florida, I don't think we've had the difficult conversations of how much racism exists here in my area. We have a large Hispanic population. I'm from Latin America, and Representative Murphy, I have to tell you, and you come from a different country also, there's a lot of racism in our culture, in the Hispanic culture. And I think that what I saw in these marches is that a lot of Hispanic protesters or Hispanic residents that live here in South Florida, they were demanding change also in their community, because we hear those racial slurs, those demeaning comments, and it tears at you. There is ingrained racism in our very own culture, and that's South Florida. And I think, you have a mix of Haitian Americans, Bahamian Americans, African Americans, Caribbean Americans. And to tell you the truth, a quarter of our Hispanic population actually identify themselves as Afro-Caribbean. Mm-hmm. So the beauty of our area is that it's so diverse. It's like this fabric of all the different cultures coming together. And I think coming to the United States from a different country like you and like myself, we know how difficult that is. We know the judgments that are put upon us. And because in South Florida, there's so many people that come from a different country, I think that they related to so much discrimination that they have felt. And I'm glad, and I think it's an opportunity and it's a moment for us to come together and really enact change. I'm hopeful and optimistic.
Thank you so much, Rep. Murkazal-Powell. Thanks for reminding us that even in our diversity, there's a lot of commonality and strength in that. I certainly appreciate that. Congresswoman Frankel, you were a former mayor. You bring a unique perspective to this conversation. What do you think mayors can do across this country to improve police policies and procedures? And what do you think Congress can do to support those mayors in that effort? How do you think how should mayors be balancing the need to enforce laws with showing proper respect for the rights of individuals from marginalized communities and communities of color?
First of all, thank you for the question, and I really have enjoyed all your answers tonight. Yeah, I was mayor of West Palm Beach for 8 years, and say it's West Palm Beach, not Palm Beach. It's different. We're on the other side of the bridge, and we have a very diverse urban population. And let me just start by saying that people in every neighborhood wanted safety and security, and they wanted police, but they wanted good policing, they wanted community policing. And so this effort should be about reform, not about defunding, but about reform. And although I think it's very, very important to have national standards and set incentives, what I have told my local people, my local mayors, county commission, is they don't need to wait for us to pass legislation, because there is much that they can do at the local level. And every single police department, their policies, their training, their hiring practices, everything needs to be reviewed. And for the commissions who may not control the policing, but they control the budget, they have to make reform contingent, or funding contingent on reform. That's what needs to be done. But as I said in my opening remarks, this is, fighting injustice and racism, whether it's police reform or whatever. These kinds of discussions have to be had at every level of society, whether it's in the education or the boardroom, the corporate boardroom, wherever it is, in the healthcare industry. These kinds of discussions are important now.
Thanks so much, Congresswoman Frankel, for your perspective, both from the local and the federal level. Boy, I just am so honored to have been on this panel with such strong women. And I know there are a few of us that have additional obligations. The night hasn't ended. Debbie has additional votes, and I know Val has some additional events and things. So I just want to say thank you so much for being on here. It's been my real pleasure. Thank you to all of our panelists. I'm Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy in Central Florida, and it's just been a pleasure to be here tonight. With that, let me recognize my good friend, Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz, who will close us out tonight. Debbie?
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and really thank you for the remarkable job you did on our third panel. We really are we're all like professional siblings here in our congressional delegation, and we know how to tag team. And this coming together tonight was so incredibly important for each of us. We wanted to make sure we did this together. We wanted to make sure that we convened statewide so that we could really send a strong message that this is only the beginning of our efforts, and that our commitment will be sustained so that we can really finally reach real racial justice and all that means. So thank you for tag teaming with Congressman Hastings and I tonight.
Happy to do it. Hope everybody stay safe, be well. Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next week. Well, we've reached the end of our time together. We have had such an incredible discussion this evening. It's been meaningful. It's been fruitful, and I want to thank my colleagues first and foremost, and especially our panelists. We had so many incredible moments here where we were able to really make sure that we got to the heart of the issues, and that's what we wanted to do tonight. Is not just really deal with the window dressing, but really dig deep and ask some hard questions, and make sure that we can send a strong message, and really make sure that we inspired some confidence. And a way to make sure that we can continue to inspire confidence is by bringing on our last guest, who had both travel and technical issues. So he's made me untruthful in that I am not about to wrap up our evening, because Ben Crump, the remarkable civil rights attorney who has represented so many individuals who have been wronged, and who have and so many families who have had their family members tragically killed in police brutality incidents. I'm so thrilled, and actually this is a really fitting way for us to wrap up our panel this evening. We're really fortunate tonight to be joined by Ben Crump, who is also a Floridian. So very appropriate to have you here tonight. So glad you made it, Ben. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and I'm very honored to be with you again. I think about Elijah Cummings when I look at you, because I remember the last time you, he, and I, and others were together. And he really was the embodiment of some of the brief remarks that I'm going to say, because he believed that America owed all of its citizens equal justice under the law. And so, Deb, I bring you greetings on behalf of George Floyd's family. I bring you greetings on behalf of Ahmaud Arbery's family in Brunswick, Georgia, who was killed jogging while black. I bring you greetings on behalf of Breonna Taylor's family in Louisville, Kentucky, who was just in her apartment sleeping while black, to talk about this crisis, this pandemic of racism and discrimination with our policing in America. And so I had the opportunity to testify before your House Judiciary Committee last week with Philonise Floyd, George Floyd's brother. And the one thing I really tried to convey to them, if we're going to change the culture and the behavior of policing in America, it has to start at the top with very responsible and courageous leadership. And I'm so happy that you and Congressman Hastings and the other Florida delegation have assumed the mantle of leading with this courageous and responsible leadership to speak to the fact that we can't have two justice systems in America, one for Black America and one for white America, that we truly have to endeavor to have equal justice for the United States of America, so we won't have another hashtag tomorrow. And I'm so heartbroken because there's another young man you're going to hear about, Jamal Williams, out of Indiana, who was killed today. And it's over and over again. How can we stop the people who are supposed to protect and serve us from killing our children? Never, ever have we, in just a matter of weeks, literally, every week we're hearing about another hashtag. But more than that, Debbie, because of technology, we're seeing it.
That's right.
We saw George Floyd, who had a knee on his neck by the Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin, not for 1 minute, not for 2 minutes, not for 3 minutes, not for 4 minutes, not for 5 minutes, not for 6 minutes, not for 7 minutes, not for 8 minutes, but almost 9 minutes. He said, "I can't breathe" 16 times, Debbie. I mean, he provided a documentary of his murder, but he also narrated the documentary. And that is what is so shocking, why people around the world have been in united harmony saying, "I can't breathe," because they watched that video and they could not unwatch it when he said, "I'm through now. I can't feel anything on my insides." And he called for his mama. And we all know when we first come in this world, our protector is our mother, and it's just innate. And you can only imagine when he knew he was dying, he reverted back to just subconsciously calling for his mother, even though she had been dead for 2 years.
Yeah.
And so this is what it's about, Debbie. I will conclude with saying this here. Martin Luther King asked the question, and he was very profound when he said it. He said, "The coward asked the question, is it safe?" And then he said, "Expediency asked the question, is it politically correct?" And then he said, "Oh, vanity comes along and asks the question, is it popular?" But then Dr. King said, "Conscience comes along and asks the question, is it right?"
Right.
Dr. King concluded there comes a time when one must take a position that's neither popular nor politically correct or not even safe, but one must take a position because their conscience tells them it is the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do for our leaders in Washington, D.C. to lead and finally get substantive, systematic reform in policing in America, because if we don't do it, I am so afraid that we will have another Black person killed unjustifiably, unnecessarily, and senselessly, and we'll have another city rioting and burning because people are saying enough is enough. Black lives matter, and we can't continue to have our lives marginalized, our children marginalized. We gotta say all our children have a right to the American dream and equal opportunity to that dream, and to be able to live to fulfill the destiny that God has for them. That's all we want for our children, nothing more. That's all we want. So Debbie, whatever leadership you and the Florida delegation can provide on this issue, it is desperation time now. We can't take it in America again to wake up and see another hashtag.
Really, I couldn't say it better myself. And having known you for so many years now, really the beginning of this modern day movement to fight police brutality, the beginning of the modern day Black Lives Matter movement to make sure that we had people all across this country who clearly and loudly say that Black Lives Matter really began here in Central Florida when Trayvon Martin was really the first victim in modern times that we were able to have revealed, even though that wasn't where technology was involved, but certainly we had some modern day media attention on that case, which you really helped shine a spotlight on. And unfortunately, we've had far too many people of color since then who have been victims of police brutality. But thankfully, we had technology. While you're here, and as we wrap up, I wanna share a story that Congressman Hastings and I experienced back in 2014. This was after Ferguson. And he and I had a conversation on the House floor in late 2013. And we decided that even though we had not had an explosive incident in our community here in Broward County, we knew that tension simmered just below the surface. And we wanted to get ahead of it. So we also we're federal office holders. We don't have anything directly to do with local policing, local law enforcement, but we wanted to use our platform that we had as federal office holders to convene the community. So we created a law enforcement community task force that had elected leaders, young people. We held town halls in high schools with minority populations. We sat down with police academy cadets. We brought the police chiefs together. At the first roundtable, a young lady at Dillard High School, who was the student body president back then, she stepped up and spoke to our first roundtable discussion. And I may have told you this story, but I want people to hear this. And she said to Congressman Hastings and I and the sheriff and the assembled leaders there that what needed to change was the following. She said that in our community, on quote, my side of town, I live in Weston, which is a majority Hispanic population, but not majority Black, or not a significant Black population. She said, in your community, when kids feel danger and feel unsafe and they see the police, their instinct is to run towards the police. And she said, Congressman, in my community, when there's danger and kids feel unsafe and they see the police, their instinct is to run away. And that is devastating. That is an inequity. It still gives me chills, not the good kind, when I think about that. And we have to get to a place where everyone in America, every child in America, would feel that their local law enforcement was a refuge and not potentially be the death of them. And that's the equality, the equity that we have to achieve. And we have to go so much more beyond that. So as we wrap up tonight, if you could react to that and then also talk about, what do we need to do What can we do right away beyond the police reform to make sure that we can really make this effort to achieve racial justice, which we know won't happen overnight, a reality?
Yes, ma'am. And that young girl spoke for many of our people in the Black community. We don't see the police as someone who protects and serves us. What we see the police as is somebody who literally police us and send us to jail. And that's the good side of it. A lot of us, even my 7-year-old daughter, asked the question, why do the police keep killing Black people? Because it's their reality, what they're seeing in the media. And so, Debbie, what I really think the solution is this. It is about first having transparency, and then you have to add accountability to that, and then you can get to trust. Right now, oftentimes we never had transparency, and then finally with technology, we're starting to be able to see things for ourselves because cell phones and surveillance videos, not that the police are giving us the body cam footage, they still not being transparent. But so we are starting to get the transparency with technology, but what we're not seeing is the accountability. And therefore there's no trust, because we know in Broward County and communities all over America, Black people get arrested with no evidence whatsoever.
Right.
I mean, it's nothing to have probable cause, but when we are killed and there is video and still nobody is held accountable, that tells us that it's injustice, that Black lives don't matter. And so that's what we have to get to, is transparency plus accountability equals trust. And then finally, the things I think you all can do and make an immediate impact, Debbie. And because I'm on the front lines and I see it all the time, these police body cam videos that we pay these millions and millions of dollars, we should say if somebody is brutalized, or worse, if somebody's killed and the police officer did not have their body camera on, it should be a federal offense of obstruction of justice. And we won't say they're guilty, because it's always innocent until proven guilty.
Right.
There should be a rebuttable presumption that you did something wrong. Because why is this person dead from a confrontation with you and you did not have your body camera on? That's so vitally important. And then obviously, Maxine Waters and I were talking about the chokehold. We should have an absolute ban. It just makes no sense.
It should be illegal.
Yeah, and then no knock warrants, disproportionately executed against Black people. We make up only about 13%, but they execute 50% of them against Black people. I don't know if people in the white community can even fathom the police just busting open your door.
Right. I don't think you could.
But Black people, that is a reality that we know is possible. And then lastly,
we have to make that a relic and a thing of the past that perhaps generations from now, people will read about in the history books, and they won't be able to believe that was how Black people in this country were once treated. We'll make that history. And that's what this is all about. That's why Congressman Hastings and I, and it's a perfect segue to conclude, today we introduced the Police Accountability and Community Engagement Act, the PACE Act. And because you do need police accountability and community engagement, combining those like we did with our task force, putting real money behind it so that communities all across America can both engage in police accountability and also make sure that we can engage the community and come together and start the healing process, which will lead us to racial justice. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to our viewers. Please know that my colleagues and I and the Florida Democratic Congressional Delegation have only just begun, and we're going to be on the front lines fighting for racial justice every single day.
Can I just say, Debbie, thank you for giving a voice to the voiceless, and thank my personal hero and mentor, Alcee Hastings,
Yes.
always giving a voice to.
He's always led the way, always, an incredible mentor for me. Thank you all so much. Stay safe and healthy, everyone. We still have a virus out there. Please take care of yourselves. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
I can't breathe.
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 I can't
I
breathe.
can't breathe.
No puedo respirar.
I can't breathe.
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 Can't breathe. I can't breathe.
I can't breathe.
I
can't breathe.
I can't breathe.
I can't breathe.
I can't breathe. Enough is enough.